When a bulletproof Bentley limped into Troy Capone's auto repair shop on Chicago's South Side during a bitter February evening, he figured it was either a setup or someone with a death wish. Rich people didn't venture into his territory, not unless they were buying something illegal or about to become a headline. But then he saw her, a 22-year-old woman trapped inside a $1.2 million wheelchair, her eyes carrying the exhausted fury of someone who'd been failed by every expert money could buy. Her security detail was tense, hands hovering near concealed weapons, while she sat motionless in equipment that should have given her freedom but had become her prison. The irony wasn't lost on Troy. He'd spent his life breaking things, and here was someone who needed something fixed that all the legitimate world's brilliance couldn't repair. Stay with me to the end, because this story will shock you to the core. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you are watching from. Now let's get into it. Troy Capone wiped grease from his hands with a rag that had seen better decades, watching the last of his legitimate customers drive away into the Chicago dusk. The auto shop had been his father's dream. A clean front for dirty money, a place where broken things got fixed and no questions got asked. Now it was just Troy's burden, another piece of the empire he'd inherited along with the guilt that came with it. His father had lost both legs to a car bomb meant for a rival family. Spent his final 8 years in a wheelchair, raging against the cheap prosthetics and substandard equipment that insurance would cover. They keep us broken on purpose, son, he'd wheezed during those last months. Easier to control what can't fight back. The memory was interrupted by the low rumble of an engine that didn't belong in this neighborhood. Troy looked up to see a black Bentley crawling through the shop's entrance, its bulletproof glass catching the fluorescent lights. The car moved wrong, hesitant, mechanical hiccups in what should have been smooth luxury. Two men in expensive suits emerged first, their eyes scanning the garage with the practiced paranoia of professional bodyguards. Then came the woman in the wheelchair, and Troy felt something twist in his chest. She was young, maybe early 20s, with blonde hair pulled back and frustration carved into every line of her face. Her wheelchair wasn't the standard hospital issue. This was high-tech machinery worth more than most people's houses. All carbon fiber and servo motors and blinking diagnostic lights. But it was fighting her. Troy had spent enough time watching his father struggle to recognize the signs. The way her shoulders tensed against the chair's positioning. How her legs sat at angles that looked engineered rather than natural. The constant micro-adjustments the machine made, each one drawing a barely visible wince. "Excuse me," one of the bodyguards called out, his hand resting casually near his jacket. "We're having some mechanical difficulties. Can you take a look?" Troy approached slowly, his eyes on the wheelchair rather than the weapons he knew were pointed at him. Up close, he could see the problem. Servo motors fighting against each other, weight distribution algorithms that assumed a theoretical patient rather than the real woman sitting in the chair. "It's not the car," Troy said quietly, crouching down beside the wheelchair. "It's this thing. Your chair's fighting you instead of helping you." The woman's eyes snapped to his, sharp and intelligent and desperate. "Every specialist in the country has looked at this equipment. It's state-of-the-art." "State-of-the-art doesn't mean it's right for you." Troy's voice carried the weight of old pain, old promises. "I might be able to help." The bodyguards tensed, but the woman held up a hand. In that gesture, Troy saw his father's defiance, the refusal to accept that broken had to mean powerless. "You're not a doctor," she said. "No," Troy replied, meeting her gaze. "But I know how to fix things that are supposed to work, but don't." Her name was Schroeder Emma, and she told her story like someone reciting evidence in a courtroom. Clinical, detached, as if distance could make the pain less real. 3 years ago, her father's Bentley had been T-boned by a semi-truck on Lakeshore Drive. What the police called an accident, what the insurance companies labeled driver error, what Troy recognized as the signature of the Torino family's favorite cleanup crew. Spinal compression, traumatic brain injury, extensive nerve damage, Emma recited, her fingers drumming against the wheelchair's armrest. 17 specialists for experimental treatments, and enough physical therapy to fund a small hospital. This chair cost $1.2 million and was supposed to be my salvation. Troy circled the wheelchair slowly, his trained eye catching details the designers had missed. The servo timing was off by microseconds. Nothing a computer would flag, but enough to create constant resistance against Emma's natural movement patterns. The weight distribution system was calibrated for a theoretical patient, not the real woman whose body was trying to heal itself despite the machine's interference. Your left hip wants to rotate 3 degrees more than the chair allows, Troy said, kneeling beside the mechanism. And these pressure sensors are triggering support protocols that are actually preventing your muscles from strengthening. Emma's laugh was bitter. You figured that out in 5 minutes? I've had teams of engineers work on this thing. Engineers build what they're told to build. They don't ask if it's right. Troy's hands moved over the chair's frame, feeling for stress points and resistance patterns. This isn't designed to help you get better. It's designed to keep you stable. As Troy examined the chair's undercarriage, Emma's hand moved with practiced stealth, pressing a small device against the fabric of his work jacket. The tracker was no bigger than a button, its adhesive designed to bond with cloth fibers. She'd learned to be careful about who she trusted, especially men who claimed they could fix what experts couldn't. The basement workshop, Troy said, straightening up. I've got tools down there that can handle this kind of precision work. But I'll need the chair for at least a week, maybe 2. Emma's security detail shifted nervously. Being separated from their principal's mobility equipment violated every protocol they'd been trained to follow. But Emma was already nodding, her decision made with the desperate calculation of someone who'd run out of safe options. What's the worst that could happen? She asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. I'm already trapped. Troy met her gaze, seeing his father's stubborn hope reflected in her eyes. I can't promise it'll work, but I can promise I'll treat it like my life depends on it. What he didn't know was that Emma's life might actually depend on it, and that she'd just made sure she could track every move he made. The basement workshop beneath Capone's auto repair existed in a world between legitimate business and criminal necessity. Steel workbenches lined concrete walls, precision tools hanging in perfect order beside equipment that could crack safes or strip engines with equal efficiency. Troy had built this space for his father, back when the old man still believed he might walk again. Emma's wheelchair sat under harsh fluorescent lights like a patient on an operating table. Troy approached it with the reverence of a surgeon, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he began the disassembly. Each component revealed itself slowly. Servo motors worth more than most cars, pressure sensors calibrated to medical-grade precision, computer systems that could run a small aircraft. But as Troy dug deeper, his father's voice echoed in his memory. They don't want us whole, son. Broken people are profitable people. The old man had fought his prosthetics for years, raging against artificial limitations that kept him dependent on specialists and replacement parts. Troy had dismissed it as paranoia born from pain. Now, staring at Emma's wheelchair's programming, he wasn't so sure. The servo timing wasn't just wrong, it was deliberately restricted. Safety protocols that triggered at the first sign of natural movement, preventing the very muscle development that might lead to recovery. Weight distribution algorithms that assumed permanent disability rather than temporary limitation. Most damning of all, artificial limiters built into the core programming, invisible restrictions that would keep Emma dependent on the chair indefinitely. Son of a bitch, Troy muttered, his fingers tracing circuit boards that cost more than his monthly income. This wasn't medical equipment. It was a subscription service disguised as healthcare, designed to generate revenue rather than restore function. He started with the hip assembly, the most obvious point of conflict between machine and human. The modification was delicate work, requiring him to bypass safety protocols without triggering the chair's diagnostic systems. Troy's hands moved with the precision of someone who'd learned to defuse bombs and hotwire cars with equal skill. The first test was promising. The hip's servo responded to natural movement patterns instead of fighting them, allowing rotation that Emma's body had been craving for 3 years. But as Troy engaged the system, warning lights began flashing across the diagnostic panel. Safety protocols were kicking in, interpreting the improved mobility as a malfunction rather than progress. The chair's computer was trying to lock down the very improvements Troy had made, protecting Emma from the possibility of healing. He stared at the blinking error codes, understanding finally what his father had tried to tell him. The system wasn't broken, it was working exactly as designed. Troy reached for his phone, knowing he'd need to call Emma with news that would change everything she believed about her condition. The wheelchair could be fixed, but first they'd have to break it completely. The first time Emma stood, Troy thought she might collapse from the shock of it. 3 weeks of modifications had led to this moment in his basement workshop, her hands gripping parallel bars he'd welded together from scrap metal. Her legs trembled with the effort of supporting weight they hadn't carried in 3 years, but she was upright, breathing hard and laughing through tears she tried to hide. "Holy shit," she whispered, then immediately apologized for the language. "You're standing in a mob boss's basement," Troy said, steadying her elbow. "I think we're past worrying about your vocabulary." The progress came in increments that would have seemed insignificant to anyone else, but felt miraculous to Emma. 5 minutes of standing became 10, then 20. Her balance improved daily as muscles remembered their purpose. The wheelchair's modifications allowed her body to strengthen naturally instead of fighting against artificial restrictions, and hope crept back into her voice when she talked about the future. Troy's crew adopted her without question. Sal brought her coffee that was too strong and pastries from his mother's bakery. Marcus, the youngest of Troy's soldiers, appointed himself her unofficial bodyguard, hovering nearby during her therapy sessions with the protective instincts of a younger brother. Even Vince, who trusted no one outside the family, started asking about her progress and bringing mechanical suggestions that were surprisingly insightful. "She's good for you, boss," Sal observed one afternoon, watching Troy adjust the wheelchair's balance sensors with the patience of a watchmaker. "Haven't seen you this focused since your old man passed." Emma heard the comment from across the workshop, and something twisted in her chest. Through the tracking device she'd planted on Troy's jacket, she'd been monitoring his movements for weeks, expecting to find evidence of criminal activity she could use against him. Instead, she discovered a man who spent his evenings researching spinal cord rehabilitation and his mornings calling medical supply companies to source better components for her chair. The tracker's data painted a picture that contradicted everything she'd assumed about Troy Capone. His locations were mundane: the workshop, a medical library, meetings with legitimate physical therapists who consulted on her case. His phone calls, when she could intercept them, were about servo calibration and muscle stimulation protocols, not territory disputes or criminal enterprises. Watching him now, his scarred hands gentle as he helped her practice weight shifts, Emma felt the weight of her deception growing heavier. Troy had given her something no amount of money could buy, the possibility of walking again, and she'd repaid his trust by treating him like a suspect in a crime that was looking less likely by the day. "Troy," she said quietly, testing her balance without the parallel bars, "there's something I need to tell you." But before she could confess, her phone buzzed with an encrypted message that made her blood run cold. Someone else had been watching Troy's activities, and they weren't pleased with his success. Emma had been standing for 20 minutes without support when she made the decision that would change everything. Troy was across the workshop, fine-tuning servo responses on a backup motor, when she quietly released her grip on the parallel bars and took her first independent step in 3 years. "Emma, wait," Troy started, but she was already moving, her face set with the determination of someone who'd spent too long accepting limitations. The first step was shaky but solid. The second found better balance. By the third, muscle memory was awakening, her body remembering what it meant to move through space under its own power. 4, 5, 6 steps carried her across the workshop floor, each one more confident than the last. For a moment that felt like forever, Emma was walking, really walking, and the joy on her face was worth every risk Troy had taken. Then the 7th step triggered something in the wheelchair's monitoring system. The servo lockdown was instantaneous and brutal. Safety protocols that Troy thought he'd bypassed suddenly engaged, sending override signals to the neural interface still connected to Emma's spine. Her left leg seized mid-stride, the artificial muscle stimulation cutting out completely. She collapsed hard, her cry of pain echoing off the concrete walls as her body hit the workshop floor. Troy was beside her in seconds, but it was already too late. The tracking device Emma had planted weeks ago had been transmitting her location continuously, and her security detail had standing orders to respond to any distress signal. The basement door exploded inward as 3 men in tactical gear stormed down the stairs, weapons drawn and trained on Troy. "Step away from her." The lead bodyguard's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Hands where we can see them." Troy raised his hands slowly, his eyes never leaving Emma's crumpled form. She was conscious but shaking, the neural feedback from the servo lockdown sending spasms through her legs. She needs medical attention, he said quietly. The interface is overloading her nervous system. You don't get to talk, the bodyguard snapped, but before he could say more, footsteps thundered down the stairs. Marcus Emma appeared like a force of nature, his expensive suit incongruous in the grimy workshop. His face was a mask of fury and terror as he took in the scene, his daughter on the floor, a known criminal standing over her, and 3 years of careful medical protocols apparently shattered in a basement that smelled of motor oil and desperation. What the hell have you done to my daughter? Marcus's voice was deadly quiet, the kind of calm that preceded violence. I trusted you with her life, and this is what happens. Emma struggled to sit up, her voice weak but defiant. Dad, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. Marcus cut her off, his eyes never leaving Troy. This man has been experimenting on you like some kind of lab rat. Emma's hand moved to Troy's jacket with deliberate precision, her fingers finding the small device she'd planted weeks ago. She peeled it away from the fabric and held it up, the tracker's LED blinking steadily in the harsh workshop light. I put this on you the first day we met, she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. But not for the reasons you think. Marcus stared at his daughter, confusion replacing anger. Emma, what are you talking about? I've been tracking him, Dad. But not to spy on him, to gather evidence. Emma struggled to her feet, refusing Troy's offered hand. Evidence against Meridian Medical Systems. She pulled out her phone, fingers moving across the screen with practiced efficiency. Encrypted files appeared, dense with technical specifications and corporate communications. Recovery limiters, Dad. Artificial restrictions built into every piece of equipment they've ever sold me. They've been keeping me disabled on purpose. Troy felt the world shift beneath his feet. You knew? This whole time, you knew what they were doing. I suspected. Emma's eyes met his, and he saw the calculating intelligence he'd missed before. My accident wasn't random. The Torino family doesn't use semi-trucks. That's not their style. But Meridian Medical needed a high-profile test case for their new, permanent mobility solutions. Someone young, wealthy, with enough media attention to legitimize their technology. Marcus's face had gone pale. That's impossible. The police investigation was bought and paid for. Emma swiped to another file, showing bank transfers and communication logs. Meridian orchestrated the whole thing. They needed someone who would never fully recover, someone who would spend millions on their equipment and serve as a poster child for accepting limitations. Troy's hands clenched into fists. So you used me. Figured a criminal wouldn't follow their protocols. I chose you because you were the only person in Chicago who might actually help me instead of managing me. Emma's voice carried 3 years of accumulated rage. Every specialist, every engineer, every therapist. They all worked within Meridian's guidelines. They all accepted that broken was my new normal. She pulled up more files, showing months of surveillance data. I've been building a federal case for 8 months. The tracking device wasn't just monitoring your location. It was documenting every modification you made, every improvement that Meridian claimed was impossible. Jesus Christ, Emma. Marcus sank into a nearby chair, the weight of revelation crushing his assumptions. Why didn't you tell me? Because you would have stopped me. Just like you're trying to stop me now. Emma looked around the workshop, at Troy's crew who had become her unlikely family, at the equipment that had given her hope. I needed proof that recovery was possible. Troy gave me that proof. Troy stared at her, seeing her clearly for the first time. Not a victim, but a warrior who'd been fighting a war he'd never even known existed. The alliance formed in the space between one heartbeat and the next, sealed not with handshakes, but with the shared understanding that they'd both been played by forces larger than Chicago's criminal underworld. Troy looked at Emma, really looked at her, and saw not the broken billionaire's daughter he'd thought he was helping, but a strategist who'd been 3 moves ahead from the beginning. You want to take down Meridian? Troy said. It wasn't a question. I want to burn them to the ground. Emma's voice carried the cold fury of someone who'd spent 3 years planning revenge. But I need your network to do it. Troy's crew exchanged glances. They'd followed him into territory wars and federal investigations, but corporate espionage was new ground. Still, Sal was the first to nod. What do you need, boss? Witnesses, Emma said, pulling up files on her phone. Meridian has been running this scam for years. Other patients, other families who've been kept dependent on their equipment. But they're scared to come forward, afraid of losing what little mobility they have. Fear's a language we speak fluently, Vince observed, his scarred face thoughtful. But protection's another service we provide. Emma's investigation had uncovered a network of victims across the Midwest, patients whose recoveries had been artificially limited, families bankrupted by equipment designed to fail. But the deeper Troy's people dug, the darker the conspiracy became. The semi-truck that had hit Emma's car hadn't been driven by a random trucker having a bad day. The driver had been a Meridian contractor, paid to create the exact type of spinal injury their new equipment was designed to manage. They killed people, Marcus said quietly, staring at bank records that showed payments to the truck driver's family after his convenient suicide. My daughter's accident was a corporate assassination attempt. Not an attempt, Emma corrected. A successful murder of who I used to be. They just kept my body alive to serve their purposes. The planning session stretched into the early hours of morning, Troy's criminal expertise merging with Emma's legal strategy. They would need evidence that would stand up in federal court, but they'd also need to neutralize Meridian's ability to silence witnesses or destroy records. Street justice and legal justice, working in parallel toward the same goal. They have corporate security, political connections, enough money to make problems disappear, Troy said, studying building schematics of Meridian's Chicago headquarters. But they don't have what we have. Which is? Emma asked. Troy looked around the workshop at his crew, at Marcus who'd gone from enemy to ally in the space of an hour, at Emma whose wheelchair had become a weapon in her war against the system that created it. People who've got nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The takedown would require precision, timing, and the kind of coordinated effort that Troy's organization had perfected over decades of surviving in Chicago's underworld. But this time, they weren't fighting for territory or profit. They were fighting for the right to heal. The first attempt on Emma's life came at 3:47 a.m., delivered not by street thugs, but by men in expensive suits who moved with military precision. Troy's early warning system, a network of informants stretching from the docks to the Gold Coast, gave them barely enough time to evacuate the workshop before Meridian's corporate security team arrived with enough firepower to level a city block. They're not playing games anymore, Troy said, helping Emma into the armored SUV Sal had stolen from a federal impound lot. Your evidence must have them scared. Emma's laptop was already open, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she initiated upload protocols to servers scattered across 3 continents. Scared enough to abandon subtlety. That's good. Desperation makes people sloppy. The chase through Chicago's pre-dawn streets became a 3-way dance between Meridian's security forces, Troy's crew, and the Torino family soldiers who'd been watching both groups with growing interest. Corporate SUVs with tinted windows wove between stolen muscle cars and legitimate police vehicles whose loyalties had been purchased with briefcases full of cash. Vince's voice crackled through the radio. Boss, we got Torino shooters moving in from the west. Looks like Meridian made them an offer. How much of the upload is complete? Troy asked Emma, taking a hard right that sent sparks flying from the SUV's reinforced bumper. 60%. I need 10 more minutes. You've got 5. Troy's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Meridian board meeting moved up. They're voting to liquidate all evidence. Now or never. The final approach to Meridian's corporate headquarters required abandoning the vehicles and moving on foot through the underground tunnels that connected Chicago's financial district. Troy's knowledge of the city's hidden infrastructure, gained through decades of moving contraband and avoiding surveillance, became their lifeline as corporate security teams swept the streets above. Emma's wheelchair, modified beyond recognition, moved silently through the darkness. The same equipment that had once imprisoned her now served as a mobile command center, its hidden compartments carrying enough encrypted drives to destroy Meridian's entire operation. The elevator to the 42nd floor was a trap they walked into willingly. As the doors closed, Emma's upload hit 100%, and every major news outlet in the country received simultaneous data dumps exposing Meridian's conspiracy. By the time they reached the executive boardroom, the company's stock price was already in free fall. Ms. Emma, Meridian CEO, stood behind a conference table surrounded by lawyers and security personnel. I believe you have something that belongs to us. Emma rose from her wheelchair, not the labored struggle of weeks past, but the fluid motion of someone who'd reclaimed her body from corporate control. You're right. she said, her voice carrying across the room. I do have something of yours. She smiled, and Troy saw the predator she'd always been beneath the victim's mask. Your complete destruction. The federal raids began at dawn, synchronized across 17 cities as FBI teams descended on Meridian medical facilities with warrants that Emma's evidence had made ironclad. Troy watched the news coverage from his workshop, seeing corporate executives led away in handcuffs while their billion-dollar empire crumbled in real time. The same morning shows that had once featured Emma as an inspiration for accepting limitations now broadcast her walking freely across the courthouse steps. Feels different, doesn't it? Emma said, standing beside him without support, her modified wheelchair folded and stored like the relic it had become. Walking when it's actually your choice. Troy nodded, understanding the weight of that freedom in ways most people never would. His father had died believing he'd never walk again, accepting limitations that had been artificially imposed by the same system Emma had just destroyed. He would have liked seeing this, Troy said quietly. The federal prosecutor's office had been surprisingly accommodating once they understood the scope of Meridian's conspiracy. Troy's testimony about corporate assassination attempts and medical device sabotage carried more weight than his criminal record, and the plea agreement reflected that reality. Community service, probation, and cooperation with ongoing investigations. A slap on the wrist for someone who'd helped expose a conspiracy that had affected thousands of patients nationwide. The Torinos won a meeting, Sal reported, entering the workshop with the careful neutrality he reserved for delicate negotiations. Seems they're interested in discussing mutual interests. The peace summit took place in neutral territory, a restaurant in Little Italy that had been serving both families for 3 generations. Vincent Torino, patriarch of the rival clan, sat across from Troy with the wary respect of someone who'd underestimated his opponent. This Meridian thing, Vincent said, cutting his veal with surgical precision, made us all look like amateurs. Corporate boardrooms are more ruthless than anything we've ever done. Troy sipped his wine, tasting the irony. Turns out the real criminals wear suits and hide behind medical licenses. My nephew's got cerebral palsy, Vincent continued. Been in one of their chairs for 8 years. After seeing what you did for the Emma girl. He let the sentence hang, but the implication was clear. The treaty they negotiated that night went beyond traditional territorial agreements. Both families would pool resources to help patients trapped by Meridian's equipment, using their networks to protect witnesses and gather evidence for ongoing federal cases. Street justice and legitimate justice, working in parallel toward the same goal. Emma's foundation launched 6 months later, funded by Meridian's liquidated assets and staffed by engineers who'd been silenced by corporate NDAs. The first patient they helped was Vincent's nephew, whose modified wheelchair allowed him to stand for the first time in nearly a decade. Troy kept the original tracking device Emma had planted on his jacket, mounted in a frame on his workshop wall. A reminder that trust could grow from the most unlikely soil, and that sometimes the best way to fix something was to break it completely first. The Emma Foundation occupied 3 floors of a renovated warehouse on Chicago's north side, its workshops humming with the sound of precision tools and quiet conversations between engineers and patients. Emma moved through the space with the confidence of someone who'd built something meaningful from the ashes of her own suffering, her footsteps echoing off polished concrete floors that had once housed Meridian's Chicago distribution center. Poetic justice, she'd said when signing the lease. Turning their warehouse into our workshop. Troy found himself spending more time at the foundation than at his auto shop, his criminal empire gradually transforming into something resembling legitimate business. The federal prosecutor had been clear. Continued cooperation meant continued freedom, and Troy discovered he preferred fixing wheelchairs to fixing territorial disputes. His crew adapted with the pragmatic flexibility that had kept them alive in Chicago's underworld, their skills in logistics and protection translating surprisingly well to patient advocacy and witness security. Never thought I'd be running security for physical therapists, Vince observed, watching a team of engineers test a new mobility prototype. But the pay's better and nobody's shooting at us. The tracking device sat in a place of honor on Emma's desk, no longer a tool of surveillance, but a symbol of how trust could evolve from the most suspicious beginnings. She'd had it mounted in crystal, a reminder that sometimes the best relationships started with the worst assumptions. Marcus had surprised everyone by becoming the foundation's most effective fundraiser, his guilt over Emma's suffering channeled into relentless advocacy for medical device reform. The billionaire who'd once trusted corporate expertise above all else now testified before Congress about the dangers of profit-driven healthcare, his daughter's transformation serving as undeniable proof that recovery was possible when patients came before shareholders. The ripple effects spread far beyond Chicago. Meridian's collapse had triggered investigations into the entire medical device industry, revealing a pattern of artificial limitations and planned obsolescence that had kept millions of patients dependent on equipment designed to fail. Emma's foundation became the model for patient-centered innovation, its success inspiring similar organizations across the country. On a crisp October evening, Troy stood in the doorway of his auto shop, watching Emma walk down the street toward the foundation's headquarters. She moved with the easy grace of someone who'd reclaimed her body from corporate control, her stride confident and unafraid. The same streets that had once seemed dangerous to a billionaire's daughter now welcomed her as a neighbor, a fighter, a force for change. She paused at the corner, looking back toward his shop, and raised her hand in a small wave. Troy nodded in return, understanding that some partnerships transcended the circumstances that created them. They'd started as strangers thrown together by broken machinery and mutual suspicion. They'd become something rarer, allies who'd learned that healing required breaking the systems that profited from keeping people broken. Emma disappeared around the corner, walking freely into whatever came next, while Troy returned to his workshop, where broken things waited to be made whole again.